I'm going to start with the statistic I just saw this morning at 8:30, that 2.1 million additional Americans are out of work, bringing it to a total of approximately 40 million out of work in 10 weeks, which I know this is probably the most overused word right now, but this is unprecedented. We have never seen anything like this. But for those of us who have lived through the 2008 financial crisis, I thought that is a good recent downturn in the economy to look at to compare what we might have going forward. And just to give some quick reference, if you remember back in the 2008-2009 financial crisis, you had household United States names like GM, Chrysler, Washington Mutual, and IndyMac file for bankruptcy. In addition, you had bailed out by the federal government AIG, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and Citigroup, and you had companies such as Bear Stearns, Wachovia, and CIT just simply go under, and those were all just to name a few. I think the comparison and the contrast to the 2008 financial crisis and today, at least in the United States, is the swift actions being taken by the Federal Reserve in acting as a lender of last resort to central banks, to municipalities, for mortgage lenders, to corporations. Back in mid-March, if you look at some of the articles that are out there, the credit markets were effectively seizing up, but the various Federal Reserves around the United States started lending money, and the Fed really stepped up big time so that you didn't have the financial institution crisis that you saw back in 2008. So far, what have we seen in the past 2 to 3 months as far as restructuring and bankruptcy is concerned? I just had scribbled out on my pad next to me that I'm looking at. You've seen, again, household and international names such as Neiman Marcus, JCPenney, J.Crew, Hertz, Tuesday Morning, Gold's Gym, Modell's, Pier 1, and just overnight Advantage Rent-A-Car, which is an affiliate of Hertz, I believe, out of Canada. They've all filed restructurings, and in the past 24 hours, you have Amtrak, Boeing, and American Airlines all announcing enormous layoffs, and American Airlines CEO coming out with a pronouncement that we will not file for bankruptcy again. So with that, I think we are at the tip of the iceberg. Looking at who filed for bankruptcy and restructuring back in 2008, who's filed so far, I think the economic havoc that's been wreaked will have a lasting effect for months and years going forward. In addition to the United States Federal Reserve, I believe you've also seen world central banks also step up big time and making sure international credit markets have not frozen up. So that kind of broad, overview, I would open it up. I could either, go to Howard and talk about additional United States measures to help out the United States economy. If Howard wants to join about the Paycheck Protection Program, if he's ready, or we can also go internationally and get the sense of our international perspectives both in Europe and in South America.
Well, Ray, it's Howard. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Let me talk for a few minutes about the CARES Act, or the Payroll Protection Program. I think this is a good segue to talk about that because I want to address some of the provisions of the law, some of the things that the law protects, and some of the things that are excluded from the law. So let me start by talking about it. The PPP program, or the CARES Act, was passed by Congress to address the economic fallout from COVID-19. Congress initially made available about $3 trillion in coronavirus relief in 4 separate measures over the last 2 months. And remarkably, there is another bill in the House of Representatives that's been passed for an additional $3 trillion. Now that's very controversial. It hasn't gotten to the president. He said he's not going to sign it. So there's much yet to be done about that. But basically, under the PPP program, it makes funds available of up to $10 million in loans under various criteria to address certain borrowers' needs. And what's interesting about this law is, first of all, it doesn't require any collateral and no personal guarantees. So in many respects, it's relatively easy money to get. The borrower must be a small business concern or a business with no more than 500 U.S. resident employees. An important restriction on the money is that it has to be used for payroll taxes, and healthcare benefits through June 30th, mortgage interest, rent, and utilities, and interest on certain pre-existing debts. To get the money, though, it limits the amount of employees you can lay off and limits the reduction in hours you can impose on employees. The loans are funded by the Small Business Administration and administered through banks where the applicants make their application. And what's most interesting about this statute is the loan is forgiven if the borrower complies with the rules of how the money must be used. And the best practices here is a borrower gets the funds to deposit the money in a segregated account, do not commingle it with other funds, pay only permitted expenses, and maintain scrupulous accounting to ensure that you can prove you properly used the funds. If, however, it turns out you don't comply, the loan must be repaid within 2 years at a ridiculous interest rate of 1%. Another fascinating part about the law is that it does not impose debt forgiveness income on the forgiven debt. In other words, there's no income tax charged at the federal level if the money is borrowed, retained, and not repaid. There's a whole laundry list in the statute of businesses that are not eligible. And I just want to touch on a couple of examples of ineligible businesses. Congress decided that it was not going to make these funds available for businesses who are engaged in the live performances of a prurient sexual nature. So Congress decided no strip clubs, sex workers, or in some cases sexual therapists were allowed to access these funds. So there's some cases that are out there. One is the Silk Exotic Gentlemen's Club, which is a strip club in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which did get a favorable ruling from the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals that upheld a temporary restraining order to require the SBA to process a loan application. And there's other court rulings in other states that have similar outcomes. Another area that's ineligible are anybody who's engaged in a business that's illegal under federal law. So that excluded all of the cannabis industry. But certain states are providing funding where cannabis is legal. The hemp business, which is related to cannabis, does qualify because under the 2019 Farm Act, the federal government legalized industrial hemp. Another kind of business that's not eligible is one where the owner of 20% or more of the company is incarcerated, on probation, on parole, or subject to an indictment. Or within the last 5 years, the applicant was convicted or pled guilty to a federal crime, to any kind of a felony. So in other words, criminals need not apply. So what happens if a company is in bankruptcy? Can it apply for the funds? And the answer to that is no. One of the exclusions is a debtor in possession in Chapter 11 is ineligible to apply for PPP funds. But to date, at least a dozen lawsuits have been filed by bankrupt debtors across the country to seek access to the PPP loan so they could restructure in bankruptcy. And there's a wide variety of outcomes. Texas and Vermont bankruptcy courts have granted temporary restraining orders to force the SBA to make funds available. The bankruptcy court in New Mexico actually ordered the SBA to fund the loan. Bankruptcy courts in Delaware and Kentucky refused to grant a TRO. And right now, the current trend seems to be against forcing the SBA to accept applications. But there are cases pending in, interestingly enough, the Diocese of Buffalo, the Diocese of Rochester in New York, and cases in Oregon, Puerto Rico, and Arizona have issues pending. In one of my cases, I encountered an interesting issue. The debtor's in Chapter 11. It's ineligible to apply for a PPP loan. It moved to dismiss its bankruptcy case, applied for the PPP loan, and is now going to refile Chapter 11 with the PPP money. So we'll see how that works. Now, one of the important changes that the CARE Act does change the bankruptcy code. So in early 2020, Subchapter 5 of Chapter 11 became effective. And basically what that did is it's a provision of the bankruptcy code that streamlined Chapter 11 for small businesses. And to be a small business under the law when it went into effect in February was you had to have less than $2.7 million in debt. The CARES Act actually increased the $2.7 million to $7.5 million, which means there'll be a substantially larger number of smaller businesses filing Chapter 11. It's much less expensive under the new law, and I think you're going to see a flood of those smaller businesses filing. So, a couple of interesting issues to think about. Are PPP funds collateral for a pre-existing secured debt? And I recently, in representing a creditor, sent a letter to a defaulted borrower demanding the turnover of the PPP money. And they haven't written us a check yet. We'll see what happens. Are PPP funds cash collateral in a Chapter 11 that the debtor cannot use without court permission and without providing the secured creditor with adequate protection? I don't know. We'll find out as that issue starts to work its way through the courts. Now, we've all heard about retail, restaurants, and hospitality industries in trouble. Ray made a good observation a few minutes ago, and I want to touch on that. This morning's Bloomberg, the headline, "Big bankruptcies sweep the U.S. in the fastest pace since May of 2009. And they point out that in May of 2020 alone, 27 companies with more than $50 million in debt each filed Chapter 11. So think about what industries are going to face a wave of filing. We know about the obvious: cruise ships, airlines. Two of them Avianca just filed, and I think another one in South America just filed yesterday. But we have the obvious. But think about other industries that are impacted by those industries. And I think in terms of the supply chain, the trucking industry, food suppliers to restaurants. We know the dairy business is in trouble. Municipalities are going to be filing because they are losing tax revenues. Also, consider how our personal habits have changed during this time and kind of ask yourself, what if we continue to live the way we're living now and forsake a lot of the work, a lot of the industries and businesses we enjoyed before? What's the impact going to be on them? So I think the bottom line here is on the PPP program, it's very helpful, but I think there are systemic problems in our economy that are going to result in a substantial number of Chapter 11 filings and attempted restructures. Some are going to work, many will not, and I think businesses and industries are going to change dramatically as a result of what we're dealing with today. Ray?
Thank you, Howard.
I couldn't agree with you more, Howard. I think you hit the nail on the head. I thought it'd be a good time to get an international perspective. Ivan or Francisco, do either of you want to throw in a few comments about what's going on and what you're seeing?
Sure. I can start if you want, Ray. Thanks. And just to remember you that I'm from Argentina. I'm a partner with Steinberg and Viñas in Argentina. And I want to say a few words as regards what is happening with the whole business of restructuring, insolvency, and distress M&A in the region. And I must start by saying that the situation in the region is not that good. Some of our countries were struggling with economic difficulties in December 2019, and then the pandemic hit the region. So the situation now it's complicated. It's easy to explain because we have almost the same situation all over the region. Most of our countries entered into mandatory lockdown in mid-March, and we are still in that situation with postponements every 15 days. So As a consequence of both things, the situation that we had in December and the lockdown, lots of industries started experiencing financial difficulties, which in some cases, I think it's obvious that will lead to bankruptcy, in some others into at least restructuring or reorganization procedures. As regards our governments in the region, the government granted a minimum help to different sectors with, let's say, cheap credit facilities and some aid in salary payments, but in many cases it is not enough. So we are in the middle of a huge crisis, and many companies will go bankrupt. Above that, I think that we also have to mention that in all of our countries we have almost no judiciary power. Our courts are closed and only working on an exception basis. Hence, we almost have no bankruptcy or insolvency processes going on. So I think that they are mostly stopped. In the last weeks, our Supreme Court stated that lower courts should be resuming processes to the extent that they are able to do so remotely, and notwithstanding that we are in a recess and there are no due date, which is sort of contradiction. So we will see what happens. And on top of that, it is rumored that the government will most likely be issuing some decrees banning the possibility of going bankrupt before the end of this year, pausing reorganization procedures. And this is a situation that it is mostly shared all over the region. For example, in Brazil, there's a bill of law which has preliminary approval that states some rules aiming to prevent insolvency, as well as some interim measures and amendments to the bankruptcy law, basically with automatic 30-day stay, no enforcement by creditors available, and no acceleration of loan agreements and agreements. So, having said that, and as I mentioned some weeks ago when teaching at a seminar with clients and financial advisors, I think that there are plenty of opportunities in these times in the region. First one, I think it's a good moment to restructure. For example, if you have a heavy debt, you might be eligible for a subsidized facility and exchange expensive debt for cheap one. And there's no need to be in financial trouble. I mean, it's just planning and being smart. Second one, if you are, I mean, in financial trouble, and you just can get more credit to exchange for the old one, then it might be a good opportunity to restructure banking that, at least our experience by these days is that banks are more open to discuss restructuring under the current situation. Third opportunity that I see is that with the current situation, it might be a good idea to file for restructuring procedure, which is similar to Chapter 11, because I think it will help by gaining time. As I mentioned, and this is something that is happening all over the region, all of the bankruptcy and restructuring processes will probably be stopped till the end of the year. So there will be no pressure from creditors. And then there's the fourth opportunity that I would like to mention, and that is that there are and there will be more opportunities in the field of distressed M&A. I mean, APAs, even traditional M&A. We are seeing some movement in those fields currently. So, just to finish, I think that we are in the middle of the perfect storm for sure. But however, as sad as it may sound, I think that there are huge opportunities for bankruptcy lawyers, and I foresee and I see in our case here work flooding. I mean, and it will be flooding in the coming months too. So I think that might be a short introduction to what is happening in the region. And as I said, this is something that is happening in Argentina, Chile, Peru, Colombia, Brazil. So we share mostly the same situation and probably the same difficulties. Right?
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Ivan, what are you seeing from Europe? Do you have any observations to share?
Yes. Regarding the Europe, I think we have very similar situation from what you were talking about. Europe generally is trying, I think, to suppress this crisis the similar way it is fighting the coronavirus, to try to slow down the flood. So some countries, some bigger countries in Europe, introduced moratoriums in initiating bankruptcy proceedings. They also made some exemptions in this respect for the companies that are hit by coronavirus, and they provided certain deadlines for this moratorium. So Europe is trying to ease for these companies that are distressed at this moment, and to try to avoid the peak of the bankruptcies as much as possible. I think one of the most affected industries is tourism. The pandemic caught Europe just in preparation for a new touristic season, for summer season, and most of European countries' GDPs are pretty much contributed by tourism industry. We have from 5% until to 25%, such as Greece, Croatia. So I think that particularly in this field, the bankruptcies are not going to start yet, or reorganizations, because it is not yet certain whether the season will happen or not. The borders are still closed. The moment of people is just starting because pandemic is slowing down. So countries are just starting to open the borders for some nationals, and I think by the end of June it will be clear whether this particular industry will generate some money to survive at least until the end of the year. For example, France already announced the 17 billion euros of package for emergency helping the tourism industry in that country, and France is number one in terms of tourism. It had in 2019 about maybe more than 90 million of tourists coming to the country. 70% of these tourists were actually from abroad, not domestic tourists, but from other countries. And tourism there generates 10% of GDP. So this will be quite interesting. Still, I think nothing will happen in next 2 or 3 months until the summer is over, because everybody will try to survive this summer and to generate as much as possible. These countries that are mostly dependent of tourism industry are starting to open borders more quickly than the others, such as Greece has already opened its borders to the regional countries and from some countries of European Union. So I guess that by the beginning of 2021, we will have first, as Francisco said, I think it will start with reorganizations. This is similar with Chapter 11 in the U.S., whether, in prepackaged reorganization form or through the bankruptcy. And then I think after that, quickly we will have the companies going fully into bankruptcies. And I think this will create, it will be, as Francisco said, a perfect storm, but I think after this storm, it will be a sea of opportunity. And that, the tourism field will start to rebuild quickly, and that investors will show their interest in investing in those distressed businesses through the bankruptcy or reorganization, and that it will come to some normal level of operation throughout Europe.
Ivan, before I leave you, do you see tourism in Europe starting anytime soon? I think I heard you say, maybe beginning of 2021. But if that's the case, how is anybody going to survive in the major tourism spots in Europe?
Some countries are still trying to save the season, 2020 season. For example, Greece will allow tourists from June 15 to come into the country. For some countries, they will require no particular conditions to enter the country. Other countries will start maybe later in July, but still, Mediterranean basin is quite dependent on the tourism, and I think that these countries will try to ease the measures against the COVID quickly as possible. However, on the other side, we have Italy and Spain, which are quite heavily impacted by the pandemic, and they are a bit more cautious than these other Mediterranean countries. So I think they will try to salvage the season as much as possible, and that's why I think it will be delayed. The restructurings and bankruptcies in Europe will be, this field will be a little bit delayed than the other industries.
Well, thank you, Ivan. I appreciate it.
Ray,
turn out to Chris.
Ray, just to jump in for a second, and I can see, Chris has been so patient. He looks fantastic, his jacket on, he's smart. The anticipation is building. But while we have Ivan on, we're just going to build that anticipation for Chris a little bit longer. We've had a question come in on the theme of tourism and bankruptcy.
and this is clearly somebody that's picking up on a point that Francisco made about opportunities, which is, Ivan, do you believe that now is a good time to look on the market to invest in tourism? Can we expect bankruptcies within the hotel and other industries, and therefore, if you've got those deep pockets, is this a time to be looking to invest? I guess like any investment, and without any crystal balls, there's always an element of gambling. But how would you address that question?
I agree that this will be at this point of time, it will be a kind of gambling. But yes, the investors should be, tracking the situation, because, as I said, Europe is very much dependent on the tourism, and it has very well developed infrastructure for that. Hotels, restaurants, and other like leisure sector, they will become attractive, and the investors should look at these sectors to invest. But I think still it is not right point of time, because the pandemic is not yet over. You still have these measures introduced. They're still in place in some countries very strictly. They're trying they're actually starting to ease these measures, but I think maybe a month, we are a month away from seeing this picture a bit more clear.
Okay, so yes, potentially, but watch and wait for now. Okay, thanks, Ivan. Back to you, Ray, and over to you, Chris.
If I could just chime in on that point, I'll offer the counterpoint of what I've seen. And actually, you just saw it in the past couple days, where Carl Icahn sold his almost $2 billion stake in Hertz and got out of the business. And you also saw Warren Buffett sell all of his interests in all of the airlines shortly after the shutdown in the United States. So while there's opportunities out there, I think you see some of the most well-known investors, worldwide, also looking at this very, very cautiously. So I thought I'd throw that counterpoint out there.
And a good point to make. Chris, I think the floor is yours. I think you've earned it.
Thank you, Keith. Thanks, Ray. And hello, everyone. I'd like to speak briefly today about commercial real estate and retail. And the theme is the public health crisis has exacerbated pre-existing vulnerabilities. With respect to retail, we're seeing a growing divide between those retailers that are positioned to succeed in the new normal and those that are not. The two driving factors here are shifting consumer spending habits and highly leveraged balance sheets. Government-imposed lockdowns, social distancing measures have shuttered some brick-and-mortar operations, many brick-and-mortar operations, forcing layoffs and some bankruptcy filings. Some commentators have noted that the public health crisis has accelerated trends that were already occurring. Many consumers were already shifting to e-commerce, and the public health crisis has meant that shift has gained traction. Many retailers were already burdened by costly debt and highly leveraged capital structures. Now those retailers that are unable to generate the revenue to service that debt may have no recourse but to file for bankruptcy. By contrast, some retailers are thriving. The shuttering of rival stores, stimulus payments, all seem to have benefited some larger retailers. Omni-channel retailers, for example, are those retailers with the scale to sell their wares through multiple channels, through website, through social media, through physical stores. These omni-channel retailers are able to take advantage of the shift to e-commerce while still offering hands-on shoppers a physical marketplace. Successful examples include Walmart, Home Depot, Amazon, etc. Industry insiders expect omni-channel retailers to continue to gain market share. After all, in the new normal, consumers may find that e-commerce is just too convenient to abandon. Looking forward, I think we can expect highly leveraged retailers that are dependent on brick and mortar operations to seek bankruptcy relief. If they're unable to generate revenue to pay for operations, administrative expenses, and restructuring, the likely outcome is asset sales to strategic or opportunistic buyers. And so that would be the opportunity we see coming is for distressed asset buyers. Now, struggling brick and mortar retailers in turn has a downward effect on the commercial real estate market. Many retailers are struggling in the public health crisis, and even as restrictions ease, they find that they're only able to operate partially and that they need to cut expenses accordingly. So you see even large, stable businesses like Starbucks taking a fairly aggressive position with their landlords on rent relief. Landlords, in turn, have their own bills to pay, and so the choice is between deferring or abating rent in many circumstances. Deferring rent is likely the better option. And there are several reasons for this. The foremost is that accounting rules allow property owners to book income when it's deferred rent, but not when it's reduced rent. In addition, lowering rents has a negative effect on property value and also the landlord or property owner's financial covenants and their own loan obligations. And so that's something that was existing prior to the public health crisis, but it's been exacerbated. Kind of the outlier that we see in commercial real estate is office leasing. Office leasing was doing pretty well before the public health crisis, but now with a seamless transition to working remotely for many white-collar employees, a lot of businesses will reconsider the value of their lease expense. And so we see a domino effect occurring of retailers and property owners filing bankruptcy. And again, we see this as an opportunity for distressed asset buyers. Thanks, Ray.
Hey, Chris, one interesting story I saw this morning is, and I don't know if you don't mean to put you on the spot, I'm also happy to talk about the issue itself, but Hertz announced that unilaterally they're not going to pay any of their landlords for 6 months. I don't know if you saw that story, if you had a chance to see it, but that's what I saw this morning. And when I read that before I got on this webinar, I'm like, well, how are they going to do that when they're in bankruptcy? Because I believe under the United States bankruptcy laws, they're going to have to pay their rent as it comes due. I don't know if you want to give any thoughts about a large worldwide tenant like a Hertz that holds, probably huge amounts of thousands of leases all throughout the world. They're just saying, we're not going to pay our rent for 6 months. It's for our own good.
I did see that, Ray, and it is interesting. And as you pointed out, the bankruptcy code, I believe it requires 60 days of performance under a commercial lease in a Chapter 11 case. And so if I'm representing a landlord in that case, I'm moving quickly for a motion to compel, to reject, or assume that lease and make the court decide whether it's an equitable decision to keep these premises in play without any rent expense being paid. You hit the nail on the head. I think that's going to be a tough issue for a court, but the statute's quite clear. And so whether the courts use Section 105 to grant relief to debtors in this instance remains to be seen, but I wouldn't bet on it.
So out of interest, Chris, if you were representing the client, what position would you be taking?
Oh, I think you have to appeal to the court on an equitable basis that we're in a new climate. Maybe you're making a force majeure argument. Maybe you're saying that the only chance that this company has to reorganize and the welfare of the thousands of employees, it really hinges on being able to defer this rent expense for a time being. And really it's in the best interest of the landlords as well, because they'd have to mitigate their expenses as well in a breach. And finding new tenants in the normal may be difficult.
It's Howard. Chris, if I can just comment on that. I think this points up the shared problem that both tenants and landlords have. You're not going to replace the huge lot at any airport that currently houses Hertz cars with somebody else. So if the landlord is successful legally, it doesn't really accomplish very much for itself economically. So I think that the notion, and I think this is an important concept, of the current health crisis creating shared problems is really important to keep in mind, because just because you're the stronger of the two parties in the negotiations or legally doesn't mean you've accomplished anything to help yourself. So I think everybody has to step back a little bit, figure out their legal position, and then consider the economic implications of advancing it.
Excellent point, Howard.
Interestingly, Howard, this came out of our force majeure webinar a couple of weeks ago, where the discussion was very much around the ripple effects. We've talked about domino effects, and there's only so far down that chain you can sue somebody. So it's got to come back to lawyers and businesses looking at the commercial reality and collaborating and working out how to come up with a solution to move things forward in a commercial and other world which has been completely ravaged. So yeah, I think Howard's point is fundamental. I've got another question for you, Chris. You see, it was worth being last but not least, which is companies that have raised money, capital or debt against shares and or brand value. Can they stop their creditors from filing for insolvency or liquidation against them? Or would they be counted as unsecured creditors? And that's coming from Sandeep in Bangalore.
I believe they would be unsecured creditors.
Chris, we just lost you.
Could you repeat the question, Keith? I'm sorry.
Sorry. Companies that have raised money against shares and or brand value, can they stop their creditors from filing for insolvency or liquidation against them, or would they be counted as unsecured creditors?
Well, I'd imagine they'd be considered unsecured creditors in this jurisdiction. Yeah.
Francisco.
No, yeah, just want to come back to something that I believe it's interesting, which is the possibility of financing companies in bankruptcy process. I think Howard said that although in the States you have the VIP financing, companies that have filed for bankruptcy processes will not be eligible for those credits. I think that you said that. And on the opposite side, we have our region which normally will never grant credit to companies who filed for Chapter 11 or for bankruptcy processes. And nowadays, the government says that will probably make the banks to lend money to those companies. So I wanted to point out that probably in our region we will see sort of DIP financing. And my question, Howard, is whether is it available nowadays in the States, or you were saying that companies will not be eligible for the subsidized credits?
Yes, I was speaking only of the federal CARES Act money, the PPP loans. Those, at least by statute, are not available to debtors in bankruptcy. But certainly, and I represent a number of clients like this, private debtor in possession financing is readily available. And for a number of my clients, it's quite lucrative and quite safe if properly handled and properly underwritten. So there are opportunities now for private debtor in possession financing at very lucrative rates. And to Chris's point earlier, or maybe it was Ivan's point, there are going to be tremendous opportunities for well-capitalized competitors or investors to acquire assets at very low prices of companies in distressed industries, where they can use their funds to acquire assets and use whatever synergies they can create to maximize their value and acquire those assets out of bankruptcy. I think you're going to see a lot of bankruptcy sales, a lot of asset sales, Section 363 sales, as we call them in the United States. And I think that will be a very a very common occurrence in lieu of actually restructuring. And that started earlier. It's going to continue and I think accelerate going forward.
Great. Thank you, Howard. We're sort of creeping up towards the hour. I just want to check that there are no final questions coming in from our audience. You've got a couple of minutes to do that if you'd like. And maybe just to wrap up, if I can go round the panel with, I suppose, just a sort of final observation. I'm not going to ask you for a crystal ball view of what's coming, but in terms of your observations from a legal, a commercial, or even a personal perspective, maybe we'll leave you to last, Ray, and start with you, Ivan. So your final thoughts.
My apologies. I'm muted. I was muted. Yes. Well, I think it's still too early to have completely clear picture when bankruptcies are going and restructurings are going to flourish as we expect. But as I said, I think the countries are trying to delay this curve as much as possible. We are still having the fight against the virus, and I don't see that this is still the main topic, at least here in Europe. So yes, I think that by the beginning of 2021, we will be in the middle of this storm, and I think that the things are going to develop as we all expect.
Okay, so as everybody really has touched on, we have seen, back to the word unprecedented, an unprecedented amount of governmental, I suppose, bailout help, whether that's the Federal Reserve or governments around the world intervening, or putting moratoria on bankruptcy laws, as in many countries. So I guess we're in this sort of artificial bubble, slightly frozen, and until we get.
That's right, and the governments are.
Yeah, go on, Ivan. Okay, so Francisco, your final thoughts.
Well, Keith, I'm an optimistic guy, so my final thoughts are around, we are in a crisis, we are in the perfect storm, but anyway, for bankruptcy lawyers, I think that there will be plenty of opportunities, and also, as I told to our clients, the crisis might be a good opportunity to restructure, not necessarily to go bankrupt or to file for bankruptcy or restructuring processes, but also just to restructure your debts, and also to our clients, it's certainly a very good opportunity to invest in assets in many sectors of the economy, such as, tourism. There are plenty of opportunities in that field, and there will be. So I think that I should be finishing with a very optimistic view for the future of bankruptcy lawyers.
Thanks, Francisco. Chris, what are your thoughts in summary?
Francisco said it really well. As attorneys and financial professionals, we have a role to serve to our clients, to find value even in times of crisis. Here we have a crisis and we have opportunities whether it's to team up with a strategic partner or to purchase distressed assets. And so I think that's the takeaway. There are opportunities to be had here. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. While you're on, a comment from Joseph Moldovan, who sounds like he's in Serbia, but is probably one of your colleagues, Chris, saying that a note re-lease payments in J. Crew Court yesterday. In J. Crew Court yesterday denied the landlord's request for payment and extended J. Crew's time for another 60 days. Courts are allowing retail debtors to remain in bankruptcy without paying rent. There we go. Thanks, Chris. Howard, the floor is yours, and then Ray will leave you the final word.
This is about the third or fourth recession that I've been a bankruptcy lawyer and dealing with since the early 1980s. Most recessions, most economics are somewhat scientific. They have a pattern that's not necessarily entirely predictable, but there's some predictability to them. We have a variable here that we've not experienced before that I think is going to impact the predictability of this economic cycle. There are factors that are very positive in terms of the government's providing liquidity. There are factors that are not favorable with respect to the health aspects of this that may get worse, may not get worse, we don't know. And also, as I said earlier, that our change in personal behavior and how we've changed our personal habits and whether we go back to what we did before. I think that makes this particular recession more difficult to handicap. That being said, Chris said it very well, for every crisis there's an opportunity, and well-capitalized companies can profit from what's going on now. To Francisco's comment about preparing without restructuring, going back to your lenders, trying to get restructured debt. All of those things I think are on the table because the problems are pervasive and they affect everybody up and down the economic chain. So be wise, be smart, be helpful to your clients, show them the opportunities, and I think you'll serve them very well in doing so.
Thank you, Howard. Words of wisdom. Ray, last word to you in our last couple of minutes.
Sure. Listening to Howard early on, he was rattling off the industries that are affected by the current crisis, which range from airlines, hotels, amusement parks, retail, cruises, beauty and fitness, movie theaters, commercial real estate, municipal governments. I mean, the breadth of who's affected here is absolutely staggering. One topic we didn't even get into was the effect on higher education and universities, both in the United States and worldwide, and the effect on people's ability to pay tuitions, what online learning does, the ability to even come back to campus, foreign students being able to come to the United States and matriculate in classes here, United States students being able to go on study abroad programs. It's all impacted, and the economic activity that engine runs is enormous. But the one observation that I'll make that's very, very different than 2008, 2009, and going back to the 1980 savings and loan crisis is 2 points. Our central banks, both in the United States and worldwide, have stepped up with staggering, multi-trillion US dollar backings, and our financial institutions themselves are generally very healthy. Whereas back in 2008, 2009, you saw hundreds and hundreds of banks fail. In the teeth of the Great Recession, you don't see that now. So while you see household names such as Hertz or Pier 1 or JCPenney, filing for bankruptcy, the financial institutions such as Bank of America and JP Morgan and other worldwide banks, they're still financially healthy. So that does give me some optimism that, once the health issue passes, economically we'll get through this. And that's probably the last observation that's the observation I'll leave you with, is that our financial institutions are much healthier than they were 12 years ago.